All right, welcome. Today, we're diving into this incredible story of empire, a story where the main strategy for ruling millions of people gets completely turned on its head. And not just once, but twice. We're going to explore how Britain's huge experiment in India was this constant tug of war between making money, pushing their own ideas, and, well, the totally unexpected consequences of being in charge.
So you can really think about this whole story in three main acts, like a play. First up, before 1813, the policy was basically hands-off. Then, boom, a massive shift towards making some very deliberate changes. And finally, after 1858, they hit the brakes and go into a full retreat, basically undoing what they just started. It's a wild ride. And that right there is the big question we're tackling today. Why? I mean, what on earth could make a global empire completely flip its entire philosophy on how to govern and then flip it back again? The answer, as you'll see, gets right to the very heart of what colonialism was all about. Okay, so let's jump into Act 1. In the early days, the British approach was, surprisingly hands-off. And this whole idea of non-interference, it was pretty much shaped by the vision of one really influential guy. And that guy was Warren Hastings. His whole philosophy was pretty straightforward. He believed that if you want to rule India, you have to do it based on India's own customs and traditions. So because of that, the British made a very conscious choice to just stay out of it. They avoided messing with social structures, religious practices, you name it. But then 1813 happened, and this year is a huge turning point. It's basically the end of that whole hands-off era and the beginning of a brand new, much more hands-on way of thinking about India. So what kicked all this off? It was something called the Charter Act of 1813. Now, this law did one massive thing. It ended the East India Company's monopoly on trade. Suddenly, trade with India was open to any Briton who wanted in. And you can just imagine, this single act unleashed a total flood of new people, new money, and some really powerful new ideas into the subcontinent. And with these floodgates wide open, something interesting started to happen. A bunch of different groups, a really diverse and powerful coalition started to come together. And they all had one shared goal, to actively transform, or as they put it, modernize Indian society. And you had four main groups pushing for this change, and they were a real mixed bag. I mean, you had British industrialists, radical new thinkers, Christian missionaries, and, this is super important, Indian social reformers themselves, all pushing in the same direction, even if it was for totally different reasons. So first, let's talk about the industrialists. Back in Britain, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and they were looking at India and just seeing this gigantic, untapped market. But they figured, to sell our stuff, we have to change what people want, what they value. And for them, modernization was just a business strategy. It was the key to creating a whole new class of customers. Okay, at the very same time, you've got these new ideas bubbling up in Britain. Radical thinkers, like Jeremy Bentham, were looking at that old policy of Warren Hastings, the one about respecting local traditions, and they were just tearing it apart. They argued for a complete westernization of India, because in their minds, their way of doing things was just universally better. Then you've got the Christian missionaries jumping into the mix. Now, they were all for this westernization idea, but for their own reasons. Their thinking was, if we introduce Western education and knowledge, it'll completely undermine people's faith in their own religions, and that, they hoped, would pave the way for a wave of conversions to Christianity. And this part is absolutely crucial, because this push for change wasn't just coming from the outside. You had influential Indian reformers, like the amazing Raja Rambahun Roy, who were also fighting for modernization. They didn't see Western science and humanism as some foreign thing being forced on them. No, they saw it as the essential toolkit they needed to revive and reform their own society from the inside out. So you've got all this pressure for change coming from four different directions, right? But here's the thing, the British didn't just go all in. Not even close. Instead, what they did was adopt this really cautious, almost conflicted strategy, one that totally reveals the massive dilemma at the heart of their entire colonial project. They ended up with this policy of partial modernization. And yeah, it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. The idea was to introduce modern changes, but only in the areas that would help their business interests or tighten their grip on power. In any other area that didn't help them, they'd actively try to stop change from happening. And this table just lays out their predicament perfectly. It's like a pros and cons list for an empire. On the one hand, in the pros column, yeah, modernization is great for business. It creates a bigger market, makes better customers, and hey, maybe it'll even make people okay with being ruled. But then you look at the cons column, and that's where the fear kicks in. What if all this modernization gives people ideas about liberty and nationalism? What if it's the very thing that could end British rule for good?
Well, as you can probably guess, that kind of balancing act, it just couldn't last. After 1858, that cons column started to look less like a risk and more like a reality. And this brings us to Act 3, a sudden, dramatic, and total U-turn in policy. Yep, the thing they were most afraid of actually started to happen. Indians, having been introduced to all these modern ideas of liberty, equality, and national identity, started using those exact same principles to demand self-rule. The tools of the empire were being turned right back against the emperor.
So, in a bit of a panic, the British switched gears and adopted a whole new reactionary strategy. It was a 3-step plan. Step 1, ditch the Indian reformers they used to support. Step 2, start backing the most conservative, traditional elements of society. And Step 3, deliberately stir up divisions along caste and religious lines. Anything to weaken a unified nationalist movement. And this quote just says it all, doesn't it? The British increasingly withdrew their support from the reformers and gradually came to side with the socially orthodox and conservative elements of society. It was a complete 180-degree turn. They basically switched teams, siding with traditional forces in a desperate bid to hang on to control.
So we end on this really powerful thought. The story of Britain and India shows us this fundamental paradox of empire, right? The very things you do to try and reshape a society for your own gain can end up giving that society the intellectual weapons it needs to fight for its own freedom. It really makes you wonder, what happens when ideas, once they're let loose, just can't be put back in the box?